Hey, it's Lee Halliday, and we've got a cool video right now where we're going to be showing how to build a custom hook, and it's going to be called Use Fetch Suspense because it's basically going to be a hook to help us make fetch calls, but it's going to be done in such a way that you can use it along with suspense to handle what to display when the fetch request is being performed. So, this is really part 3 of a small 4-part series of demos where I'm showing in the first 2 parts, the basics of suspense, where I'm lazy loading the nav and each different page as I click around using Reach Router. So in this one, we're going to be working on the home page to create our custom hook and use it with suspense. So let's get started. Close this. All right, so here's our app. So we're going to be working on the home page, which is routed and displayed when the path is slash. So I'm just going to close everything else because it's not needed. And this is where we're going to be working. And just to show the data we're going to be fetching and displaying, I found this little API. It basically shows all the different subway routes for Boston. I'm not from there, never been there, but it's open and it's not behind cores or anything like that. So it's really sweet in my books. So this is what we'll be working with today. So we'll come back here, and the first thing we're going to do is we'll just create a component and we'll call it the Boston routes.js. And this will be just a simple component, a functional style component, so we can use hooks. So import React from React. And we will have Boston routes, which will return data ... Very nice. So export this, export default Boston routes, and then let's use it just so we can make sure things are working as we're going through the implementation. So we'll go back to home and we'll import Boston routes from Boston routes like that. And maybe we'll make the home have let's do H1. So we are home. And then just below the H1, we will put the Boston routes like that. Boston. Okay. So we're home and we've got our data which hasn't been loaded yet. So the first thing we are going to do is, because we know we're going to need it, is wrap this with suspense. And if you're starting from this video, suspense is basically used to help you deal with asynchronous code in a more easy way without keeping track of all of your own loading states and stuff like that, because Boston routes is going to be fetching an AJAX call, which is asynchronous. So what are we going to display while it's going to the server and fetching that data? We obviously could handle it all ourselves, but we're going to lean on suspense to help us out with that. So with suspense, you always have a fallback, which is what to display while this asynchronous code hasn't yet been resolved, if we're thinking in terms of promises, which we should be. And we just need what to display here. So I'm going to just call it loading data, which will simply display a div that says loading data ... So we'll come down here and put that in. Okay, so it still works. The suspense fallback is not yet being triggered because we haven't done anything asynchronous yet. So let's get into building our custom hook. So we're pretty much done in this file here. Suspense is wrapping our Boston routes. So let's come into here and we will import the code that we're going to use, and then we'll figure out the implementation for that. So we will import something called useFetchSuspense from useFetchSuspense like that. And what we'll do here is we'll say const data equals useFetchSuspense. Okay. Maybe it's a little bit weird that I haven't yet written this function, but I've done this earlier in the day for an article, so I sort of know where I'm going with this. What it's going to return is some data that will then display out here. For now, we can just say, let's stringify whatever we get back and embed that here. Okay, so I'm going to be passing just 2 parameters to use fetch suspense. The first is going to be, it's failing. The first is going to be the URL, so we will copy that and we will pass that in as the first string. And the second one is going to be, I'm going to cut out all of those params, and I'm going to be doing an object that has a query object where the first key will be this and its value will be that. So for this API, this basically, I think 0 and 1 is just subway only. There must be like a bunch of bus lines and stuff like that, but this will return only, I think it's like light and heavy rail or something like that. Okay, so this is our call. We're passing in the request URL and any query params, or it could be headers or anything else you typically pass to fetch. Obviously fails because this code does not exist. So let's go implement it. So use fetch suspense.js. Okay. So we will start by defining our function. So use fetch suspense. Be an arrow function, and we're going to be exporting it as default. Okay. So we said we were going to pass in the URL, some fetch options, which I guess theoretically could be empty if you're just fetching a straight up URL. And we'll leave that alone for now. So just 2 parameters we're passing in. Okay, so now's where we have to deal with some of the suspense specific stuff that you wouldn't have to deal with if you were just sort of using fetch on your own. So I built this diagram that shows how suspense works, and I'll try to help use it as a tool to explain what we're doing. So when React starts rendering our code, it hits our suspense component. So that would be out here, suspense component, like that. So the first thing it does, it basically checks, is suspense awaiting a promise? And if it is, so if yes, render the fallback. So that's when it knows how to display this loading data. If it is not awaiting a promise, it keeps continuing rendering the code and it renders this asynchronous code. So that would be our Boston routes, but more specifically, it's this use fetch suspense that will be doing something asynchronous. So this asynchronous code, it basically has to know, is this the first time I'm being called? And if it is, it has to initiate the asynchronous code. So how do we know whether it's the first render or not? And we'll touch later why this is important, because it sort of comes up to the top and re-renders it, and it hits this asynchronous code a second time. And you don't want it to sort of fetch both times and get in this endless fetching loop. So we need to keep track of whether or not we've made this request or not. And to do that, I'm going to use a small little caching library called LRU cache to basically keep track of the request that's being made and whether it's the first time it's been called or subsequent times. So we'll come back here and we will import LRU from LRU cache. And I think that's going to fail because I haven't added it to this to the library yet. So I'm adding MD5 as well because it's going to help me basically create my cache keys so that if I did have 5 different requests, I could keep track of them separately. Okay, so I've got LRU, and we might as well bring in the MD5 function right now as well, because we're going to need it for our cache key. And we'll create our cache here, which will be new LRU. And I think what you can pass in, if we come here, LRU, it stands for least recently used items. So it's basically a cache that you can set up to say contain 50 things in total. And it always gets rid of, once it hits that 50 mark, the things that are least recently accessed. So we can set it so that it doesn't keep growing and growing forever to have 50 items. You could have it 500 items, so you have to play with it to see what works for you, but we'll just go with 50 because we're making one request, so it doesn't matter. Okay. So now that we have our cache, what we're going to do is basically try to figure out a cache key, and we're going to use the URL and the fetch options to determine that. So we'll get a key, and our key will be made up of, let's say, the URL that you are hitting, dot, and then we're going to take an MD5 of all of the options passed in and use that as the second part of our cache key. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stringify the fetch options. And then we're going to take the MD5 of that string of options. Okay, so if I just console.log the key, see if it's working. Here we go. So this is our key. It's the URL we're hitting, and then this MD5 at the end. Okay, so now that we have our key, as I mentioned, this code gets hit the first time, and we need to determine, have we ever made this request before? So to do that, we'll need to get the value out of the cache. And we'll say cache.get, and you pass in the key that you want to read from the cache. And because on the first call, nothing exists in the cache yet, we're going to have an OR that has basically our default value for the first run. And we'll give it a status of new, and data will be null because we haven't actually performed the fetch yet. Okay. So if we keep going along, we need to determine whether it was the first request or the second request. And I know a little bit further down in the code, say down here, we're going to modify this value and set it to resolved. So what we'll do is we'll say if the value.status is resolved, we'll return that data. So this will come into play later on, but ignore that for now as we come down and we need to make the request for the first time. So if we look back to our diagram, we've come down. Is this the first render? It is, and we know that because we've read the value from our cache using the key that we just constructed. So now we need to initiate our async code. So this is the actual fetch call that we're going to be making. So we'll make a fetch to this URL given these fetch options. And the first thing the thing that fetch gives you is a promise. So we'll say then, and we've got our response, and we'll convert our response to JSON, like that. Okay. So typically you'd then add another then because you've got a second promise for when this first one is resolved. But we are going to stop for now, and we're actually going to put this into a variable. So we've got this promise in a variable, and there's a reason for that later on. But let's just finish sort of dealing with our fetch promise right here. So we can say, so when promise.then, so when it finally resolves the request, it converts it to JSON, call this code, and we've got our data. So fetch is finished, and we need to now update the value that was read from cache. So we can say the status is now resolved. We'll put the data from our fetch request into this value. So data is now equal to whatever the fetch call gave back to us. And now we need to set this new cache. So we'll use the key and we'll pass in the new value. So this promise is now resolved. So let's come down here. We've updated our cache, but here's now where suspense comes in. So we initiated the asynchronous code and we dealt with it. The next thing we need to do is throw a promise. So probably have never done that before. Typically you throw errors, but in JavaScript, anything that is thrown can be caught. So in this case, we're going to be throwing this promise. So if we follow our code down, we've got suspense, which calls Boston routes. Boston routes calls useFetch suspense. This code throws the promise, and it is caught by suspense. So we throw this promise. We've saved the result to the cache. Spelled cache wrong, great. But basically, when you throw this promise, it gets thrown way up here and it gets caught by suspense. So when suspense catches this promise, it re-renders. So if we come back down in this loop again, now it says, are we awaiting the promise? This time it will be yes, because we've just thrown a promise up here that hasn't yet been resolved. So now suspense knows to render our fallback. So, which will say loading data. Okay, so it's actually working the whole way through, but let's, for a sec, reload it. You can see it's loading data for a second, and then when the data gets filled in, it shows the actual result. So what's happening here, if we come back to this diagram, it's re-rendered, and it was awaiting the promise, so it showed the fallback, but 100 milliseconds later, the promise that was caught by suspense up here was resolved. So as soon as that happens, suspense re-renders again. So this is now like the third time suspense is being rendered. Is it awaiting a promise? No, because that promise has been resolved this time. So it hits our asynchronous code, which it's using the cache to basically find out, have I already made this request before? Is it the first render? So the first time it was yes, the first render. But this time, no, it's not the first render. And the reason we know it's not is because of this little if statement here. So we've created the key, read that key from our cache, which gave us back the value. And this time, the value has a status of resolved because we changed it to that down here when our fetch promise was resolved. So this time, we've read it. We no longer have to create this fetch request because we already have the result. We can simply return it. So now when this is rendered, it will simply receive the data back, which we're displaying as a stringified JSON stringify right here. So that's all of this. And then we could quickly render it out. So why don't we just change this to a UL, which inside we'll do data.data because our data has an attribute called data, which is an array of all of the different routes. So data.data.map. So we'll call this the route, and it will render an li. And because we're mapping, we need a key, right? So our key can be route.id. And our value in here can be route.attributes. We'll go with a long name like that. Okay. So if I refresh, loading for a split second, it's a quick API, so it's not providing a huge benefit right here. But then when it gets the data, it re-renders and shows out the final result. So I just want to go into a little bit more detail about sort of this loop, how it's being rendered multiple times. So if I come in here and I add a console.log of the value that we're getting back, this will allow us to see that this code's being called twice. The first time it will be called, and because the key doesn't exist in the cache, we're going to see this value. But the second time it's called, we're going to see that it's been resolved and that we've got our data back that we got from our fetch. So if I inspect here, so we've got our two console.logs here. So the first time it's new and the data is null. The second time it's resolved and the data is all of this data in here. I actually think because I didn't do things immutably, it modified the same object as before. So if we wanted to, just for the heck of it, why don't we do this? We'll add immer to our project so we can do things immutably. All right, we'll start this back up. So we'll come to our code and we'll import produce from immer. And if you've never seen immer before, it basically lets you immutably change data in JavaScript using sort of a mutable style. So what we'll do here is we will say that we're setting the key to, so instead of just putting in value, we will call our produce function, which we will receive. The first thing is the data we're going to be immutably changing, so that's the value that was loaded from our cache. And then what we're going to be doing is receiving sort of a new copy of that as our draft data into this arrow function here. And here we can just simply say draft.status is resolved and draft.data is data. So now I no longer need these. Okay, so just to reiterate and regurgitate what happened there, we're setting our cache, the key, to be a new value, and we're using produce to basically create a copy and change the previous one that was in the cache prior. So we're using produce, which receives that as its first argument. Then it passes to this arrow function here a copy that we're calling draft, which we can modify. And immer basically keeps track of all the changes we're making to it, and it returns the new immutable changed value of that we produced, hence why it's called produce. So now if we come up and we reload this, now when I inspect, data is actually null. It's and then the second time when it's resolved, we're getting our actual data here. Cool. So that little aside had nothing to do with creating custom hooks or suspense or anything, but immer is my favorite tool for dealing with immutable data. So if we just review this from the top down, we start in our home component and we wrap suspense around our component that will execute asynchronous code. And when I say asynchronous, it's basically something that throws a promise and eventually resolves that promise. So if it hasn't been resolved yet, it shows this loading data component. So if we go into Boston routes, this is a functional component that has our custom hook here. And this custom hook passes in the URL along with any fetch options that we want to pass on to the actual fetch call. So we come in here, it takes the URL and the fetch options and it builds a cache key. And then it looks up using that cache key, the cache, and because the first time it's called, it will not have a value, we initialize it to something. If it did find something and that something has already been resolved, great, we have the data, we can return it. If it's not resolved, meaning it's this guy right here, status new, we perform our fetch, passing in URL and fetch options, and then on the first promise, we are going to convert the response into JSON. We have our promise back, and the reason we put this into a variable instead of just doing a .then right away is so that we could later throw this promise. But down here we say, okay, so when this promise resolves, take this data that came back from response.json and update the cache. That's what we need to do. So using the cache key, we're using immer to produce a copy of this previous value, updating its status to resolved, changing its data to be whatever came back from the API call. And because Suspense detects now that this promise here that we threw, that was caught up here by Suspense, has been resolved, it triggers a re-render, which comes into Boston routes, calls our use fetch suspense code. This time, it finds the value, it's resolved, that value is returned, so we can now finally render out the data that we got back from the call. So you may be thinking this was a heck of a lot of work to just make a fetch call. And the reason it was a lot of work is because we created this hook. But now we could reuse this hook whenever we wanted, and it would only be this much code along with a suspense wrapper to get asynchronous code that handles the loading state with us having to manage our own, is loading true or false, if loading's true, and all that stuff that you've typically had to do. Cool, that's it. In the next video, in this little series, I'm going to be creating another hook that will basically end up looking very similar to this one, except instead of making a fetch call, we're going to be doing a CPU-intensive function call that will execute some code on another worker in the browser. And when that other worker has finished loading, it will render the result out. But we're going to be using our hook and suspense to help with this. Cool. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. Bye.